The Pacific Northwest. Beautiful, majestic, but with a mysteriously destructive force lying just beneath its surface. Washington State lies directly beneath the Ring of Fire, a circle that traces the continents and islands on the outer rim of the Pacific Ocean. These are populated with extinct and active volcanoes, from New Zealand to the Alaskan wilderness. But a high concentration of these volcanoes reside in the Pacific Northwest and show a very active and explosive history in the not-so-distant past. Some mountains in the chain have completely disappeared in massive eruptions, such as the sites of Crater Lake and Newberry Crater in Oregon. Sleeping giants like Mount Rainier near Seattle and Mount Hood near Portland continue to keep scientists on guard. No better reminder of the potential for this ominous destruction was the awakening of Mount St. Helens in early 1980. What started with a few deep earthquakes below the mountain soon grew into signs of volcanic life when cracks in the summit snow appeared and a steam vent blew open a small fissure. More concerns arose when the north side began to bulge at a rate of 5 feet a day. Something dreadful was coming. On May 18, 1980, the event began with the largest landslide in recorded history as one side of the mountain gave way and unleashed a massive 9-hour eruption. A giant ash cloud followed, and cities to the east were eclipsed by it in the middle of the day. After the ash settled, 57 people were dead. Hundreds of square miles of forests were destroyed. The Toutle River Valley was filled in up to 150 feet in mud and rocks for 14 miles, and the Columbia River was shut down to shipping traffic from ash and mud flows. The United States had never seen such destruction in its history. Eruptions have continued from 1980 to 1986 and 2004 through 2008 as the mountain attempts to rebuild itself, as nature always does. With an event like this, people had no idea how long it would take before this area would return to normal. Some scientists estimated hundreds of years. But nature has a way of recovering more quickly than we first thought. Through massive tree planting efforts, as well as encouraging natural growth in the blast zone, life has come back, and the recovery has been amazing. Hi, and welcome to Mount St. Helens 30 Years of Change. I'm Mark Hendricks. Over the next hour, we'll explore what happened here 30 years ago, its immediate aftermath, and the amazing changes that have occurred here since, some of them with a little bit of human help. A lot of people remember exactly what they were doing the day the mountain erupted, May 18, 1980. In fact, for many people who live within 500 miles of here, that moment is absolutely imprinted forever. Back before the eruption, these hills were covered with old-growth timber. There were lakes here, cabins, youth camps. A lot of people thought this was paradise.
The forest was absolutely gorgeous. And of course the lakes were beautiful because they were all cold glacier fed.
The lakes and the rivers were just pristine. You could go along the Toutle River where a stream comes into the Toutle, a little creek, and watch the steelhead go up those little creeks.
Just a beautiful area, and it's a chance, a lot of city kids would come up during the summer, and that was their first real experience.
I'd been up there once, and I'd climbed it in 1978, and so I had seen the area around the volcano from the summit, and obviously amazing for us.
The beautiful grandeur of Mount St. Helens has drawn people for decades. As early as the late 1800s, local residents would come up for a leisurely drive through the massive old-growth forests, first by horse, then by automobile. They would horseback ride and camp in the hundreds of square miles of this amazing outdoor wilderness. Eventually, summer cabins, lodges, and youth camps dotted the landscape, drawing visitors on a regular basis. During winter, adventurers would hike the mountain, then ski down its almost perfect slope. The more daring would ice hike, then camp at the top for an amazing view. The diehards started clubs for climbing and skiing, all for the enjoyment of spending time at the mountain. Anglers of all ages took advantage of large trout, and there was no better place to cool off than in the glacier-fed waters of Spirit Lake. It was a recreational wonderland.
I remember one particular winter when we hiked into the Y Camp and stayed there for 2 or 3 days. It was a beautiful, beautiful area up here.
My wife and I and kids spent days up here in this area. You could drive all day in the Weyerhaeuser road system and the forestry roads and never see the same thing twice.
Mount St. Helens' beauty was a bit deceiving, for it was a young volcano, lying dormant beneath its pristine glacial peaks.
Most of what the mountain we know today was built in the last 2,500 years. So it's very, very young, very active geologically. Has basically grown up since the last glaciation. So Mount St. Helens was very smooth and symmetrical cone-shaped volcano, and very much like Mount Fuji in Japan.
This area was prized for its recreation, for its great beauty, and also because it held some of the most valuable commercial timber on the planet. In fact, Weyerhaeuser's biggest parcel was just north of the blast zone. Nobody had a better appreciation for its value than Dick Ford, who was the superintendent of the land for Weyerhaeuser.
I've been in the area my whole life, but after becoming a forester for Weyerhaeuser in 1970, I became eventually a district forester. Mount St. Helens actually grows some of the best trees in the world. There's no other place in the world that has this amount of rainfall and these productive soils to grow Douglas fir. And it is the #1 building wood in the world. This was our largest district that we had anywhere in the world, and Weyerhaeuser at the time had nearly 35 million acres, so that tells you how large this was.
The last known eruption of the volcano was in 1857, and in the decades that followed, hardly anybody thought it would erupt again. Suddenly, in early 1980, the mountain began to show signs of life.
We were just doing our normal stuff, and then one day we got a notice that Mount St. Helens was becoming active, and we were to leave the area for a while, at least until they could understand. And the first notice was some very deep, long earthquakes that indicated, because they were right under the mountain, that it was something occurring inside of the mountain. As days followed and the mountain cleared up, we started seeing some cracks forming, very large cracks forming in the mountain. And then day after day, there began a buildup. And what we didn't know what was happening, but there was a magma pool forming in the mountain.
The mountain first became active in March 20th. There was one seismometer, and the folks from the University of Washington seismology lab went down and confirmed that there was earthquake activity. So there was some scrambling that went on as the earthquake activity built to establish additional seismometers around the volcano.
For those who grew up in the Pacific Northwest, the sight of a volcano's snow-capped peaks always brought a sense of awe and beauty, but hardly ever a feeling of danger.
I can remember being in a classroom and we were talking about the Cascade Mountains and being told Mount St. Helens was a dormant volcano. I never imagined it ever had the potential for doing what it did.
A lot of these guys have been around here all their lives. Families that homesteaded in the valley here. Stories of their dads and granddads that had worked out here also. So the general feeling was this was not going to be anything big.
I mean, everybody's got a volcano that's idling somewhere around them, you know, but nobody expects to ever have to deal with it or be there when it happens, because it's, you know, hundreds or thousands of years in between. I'd be long gone before that thing would ever erupt. That's what we used to talk about.
Of course, there are some people who are not all that surprised when the mountain came alive. If you know where to look, there's evidence all over this area of past eruptions, such as Silver Lake, which is the product of a mud flow from a long time ago.
On the south side of Mount St. Helens, we have the Ape Caves and the cave basalt lava flows, which are a tremendous attraction. And they're from one period, as far as we know, in Mount St. Helens history, about a couple thousand years ago, when Mount St. Helens did produce a more mafic, deeper flowed magma, these basaltic eruptions. You can find ash from Mount St. Helens from past eruptions way up in Canada. So it's been a major ash producer, and these large vertical ashfall eruptions have been an important occurrence in the past.
With the knowledge of past eruptions, scientists went to work on trying to estimate what could happen next.
There was a lot of discussion, as you can imagine, about what the mountain was doing and what it was not.
They thought that we would have a vertical blast, that all past eruptions indicated that that's what Mount St. Helens does.
And what we knew was that this volcano could explode and was known for explosive eruptions.
Visibly, the mountain was changing, and as it changed, I think even the people that have worked here a long time started realizing that this is not normal. Still didn't anticipate what actually did happen.
And what geologists tell us is that the magma was rising, the hot molten rock was rising within the volcano. As it came up into this very wet snow cone of a mountain, was drying out the inside of the mountain, and there was pressurized steam which was erupting out of the summit.
After the initial steam eruptions, scientists put more instruments on or near the mountain to try to figure out what was going to happen next and how soon. To their great alarm, St. Helens began to grow.
The instrumentation at that time, 30 years ago, was much more primitive than we have today. As a matter of fact, a fairly new instrument available to the geologists at the time were these laser rangefinders, surveying device. And they actually had a new one that they had purchased that they brought up to Mount St. Helens, and they were putting targets, prisms, on the side of the volcano and shooting a laser beam at them, and at very precise timing, it would time the speed that it took the light to go forward and back. These things are set up to measure millimeters of motion, like the growth of your fingernail type rate. They were getting parts of a meter of motion. It was moving, 5 feet a day, and they thought the instruments were incorrect. So they sent the instrument back to be recalibrated, and no, it was correct, and it was swelling at that rate.
It doesn't take any kind of a scientist really to tell you that if the side of a mountain is growing by several feet a day, that something really bad's going to happen.
The mountain was being split into two by the rising magma, and this tremendous bulge appeared throughout late March and April, and that ultimately is what collapsed.
With imminent danger on a magnitude never seen before, authorities redoubled their efforts to get people out of harm's way. But a few chose to stay despite the danger, most notably Harry Truman.
He was a stubborn old guy. He just was going to stay there. It wasn't going to happen, And you either loved him or hated him.
Even those outside the red zone were warned of possible danger and to be prepared. Authorities knew the mountain was ready to do something. But what and when was beyond anyone's wildest guess.
I think those people who were trying to prepare for the worst case scenario had no idea that their worst case scenario was better than the one that we got.
It was a beautiful Sunday morning, May the 18th of 1980, and volcanologist David Johnston was right about here on what is now called Johnston Ridge. Suddenly he radioed in, Vancouver, this is it," as he watched the mountain blow up in front of him.
The bulge that formed on the north flank of Mount St. Helens collapsed, and it created a huge landslide. It's actually the largest landslide in recorded history. It basically came down, crashed into Spirit Lake, pushed the water of Spirit Lake out and up into the adjacent peaks. About a 300-foot tall wave of water was displaced out of the lake and traveled about 800 feet up into the mountain. It basically washed up in there and washed back in. The bottom of the lake had been filled with this collapsing mountaintop, so the entire lake was lifted a couple hundred feet in the air. So the current bottom of the lake is above the former surface of the lake. The landslide was traveling fast enough that it went up and over Johnston Ridge and into the valley of South Coldwater Creek. Most of the landslide made a pretty untidy left turn and headed west following the path of least resistance down the North Fork of the Toutle River Valley and flowed about 14 miles downstream to about where that giant bridge, the Hofstede Bridge, is now. And that took about 10 minutes time for that whole thing to come to rest.
After the landslide, the full power of the mountain was unleashed.
The north flank of the mountain slides down, opens up that chamber, and basically you had this sideways release of tremendous pressure in this tremendous sideways explosion, what we call the lateral blast. And that thing was traveling supersonic at first, and over the up to 17 miles that it traveled from the volcano, it was going at an average speed of about 350 miles an hour. It was not just the blast of air, it was a blast of hot, glowing, fragmented rock.
It has been described as 500 atomic bombs, so you can imagine that. If you look at the first 6 miles, it's what we call the zone of complete destruction. There's nothing left. The trees that were there are gone, the earth is gone. It's blown to bare rock. Any vehicles or any people that were in that area have never been found.
And of course, as it tore the forest apart, in the first ridges closest to the volcano, Johnston Ridge included, it was powerful enough that it literally pulled the trees apart into pieces, and that blasted forest became part of the blast itself. Geologists call the area on Johnston Ridge the tree removal zone because the blast was literally picking the trees apart and fragmenting them, and all you'll see on Johnston Ridge today are the remnants of fragmented stumps.
The next 6 miles you have what we call the complete blowdown zone. So the wind was still 200 miles an hour and knocked over every tree standing.
It began to slow and began to be following the topography. It, of course, was carrying a lot of fragmented rock with it, so it had weight to it. It was ground hugging, and kind of like a roller coaster. It was going up and over the ridges, and so you see the kind of the patterns of the jackstrawed trees laying every which way like needles on a frozen compass, recording the direction of that blast.
Then there's another area that's 2 miles or 3 miles past that in what we call the heat-killed zone.
It was no longer traveling fast enough to knock the trees over, but it was still hot enough to kill them in a standing condition. So around the outer margins of the blast zone, there's a standing dead forest that kind of marks that last bit of where the blast was traveling along. But it wasn't the end of the eruption, because now the vent was open. He had a direct pipe from the surface down to the magma chamber. And so the mountain began erupting vertically, sending ash up to 12 miles high for about the next 9 hours. And that followed the prevailing wind direction to the northeast, and of course turned day to night in eastern Washington.
Even though the devastation was enormous, two things had become apparent about the eruption which kept many out of harm's way.
What ended up going across the valley that took out Spirit Lake had come west down the Toutle River Valley. I think it would have inundated Longview and Kelso, Castle Rock, Toutle. The loss of life would have been much, much greater. It was bad enough the way that it was.
There's been some estimates of approximately 300 people that would have been, including Weyerhaeuser employees and the contractors that we had out there, that would have been caught in this mess. None of them probably would have survived. It is very fortunate that it happened on Sunday. I would have been here.
Once the mountain began to settle down after the initial eruption, scientists got their first close-up look at the devastation, and it was nothing like what they expected.
When we first went in there, it was kind of disorienting because so much had changed. The old growth forests that were north, northwest, and northeast of the volcano were gone and had been replaced by a relatively smooth slopes covered with ash. And your initial perception is that everything's dead. I mean, I think President Carter referred to it. He said it makes the moon look like a golf course. And the other thing that was really difficult was scale. You know, these large 3-foot diameter trees were snapped in two. People described them as toothpicks when you were flying in a helicopter.
And trying to identify, looking at the Toutle River Valley, where was the highway? Where did that come in at? And, you know, and finding the places where the highway used to go is covered by walls of mud and debris.
Did go up, and I was kind of amazed at the landscape. Camp was covered with, you know, several hundred feet of mud.
There was not one green living thing in any direction, zero color. You didn't get to see a brown or a tan. Everything was ash gray.
The soils remained in place, although perhaps buried under tephra and ash that was deposited, and then further buried for good measure by pyroclastic flows. These were flows of incandescent pumice up to 800 degrees Celsius. So any biological molecules that were remaining there after the avalanche would have been vaporized and I assume reduced to their component elements or compounds. So nothing biological remained.
I did wonder what would grow.
I had doubt in my own mind about whether or not we could reforest this, that trees would actually grow up here in my lifetime.
We never dreamed that we'd ever see anything in our lifetime come back.
Up in the center of the mountain, things were still happening.
The initial crater that was observed was pretty smooth looking, and there was a vent in the center of the crater, you know, on the order of hundreds of feet across. And so a series of muffin-like lava domes began to form with this oozing rock coming up to the surface, slow-moving lava flows.
With all of the destruction before them, one positive discovery was soon noticed by the scientists and recovery teams.
There were, I think, about 120 new lakes and ponds that were formed by the eruption. I think the most remarkable ones were Coldwater Lake and Castle Lake because these were quite large. They were formed by damming streams following the eruption.
There was nothing alive in them, but they were clear and clean, and they were bright blue or in some cases emerald green. Those were, to me, potential fishing areas. You know, I was thinking about fishing in the years to come, if they're going to stock those or are the natural fish going to come back up.
As a young reporter in 1981, I landed in a news helicopter right over there next to Spirit Lake. There was downed timber everywhere. In fact, the lake was about half full of logs. Nothing alive around us. I have to tell you, it has been absolutely amazing to witness what has happened here over the last 30 years.
For everything that's a destructive force, there's also something creative. I think as humans, our perspective is to think about what's destroyed in a catastrophe. But really, for an ecosystem, there's no value-based judgment there. The ecosystem starts from where it starts. As we landed and got in there on the ground and began to poke around, it was pretty clear where water had washed the ash away or where a crack had formed in the ash. There were many, many roots of plants that were still alive underneath that layer of ash. And where the ash was washed away by a stream on a stream side or on a steep slope, we began to see sprigs of those roots resprouting. So that timing of the eruption, that May timing when there was snow in the mountains, when the ground was wet and cold, and the plants were dormant, was a key factor to lots of plants surviving where they could get through the overlying ash.
One of the important processes for the formation of new plant communities there was going to be, and has been, the formation of new soils. The eruption occurred in May. Snow was still on the ground. The gophers were still underground and under snow, and so they survived. They may not have had a lot to come back up to, but what the gophers ended up doing was they ended up mixing the soil. They ended up bringing old soils to the surface. Those soils included seeds. And so by mixing the volcanic ash with with old soil and with seeds that facilitated the germination and the establishment of plants.
What looked lifeless turned out to be anything but lifeless.
It's part of the American spirit. You get knocked down, you get up again. But should you go to the trouble of rebuilding a forest if you're at the mercy of a volcano? For Dick Ford and the Forest Service, that was the key question.
When I first came up here and I saw the devastation, I had doubt in my own mind about whether or not we could reforest this, that trees would actually grow up here in my lifetime. We had 650 miles of roads that were buried by this ash, culverts washed out, bridges gone. So we spent 3 months cleaning out the roads, fixing bridges so we could have access back into this area before we could even start harvesting. Nobody in the world had ever faced anything like this, both from salvaging logs to the reforestation. First thing we did was buy a few trees from other people that had surpluses so we could plant our next season, which would have been 1981. You need a 2-year window at minimum to plan for reforestation because that's the minimum age of a tree that you plant in the ground. We had some real challenges here though. You normally have to have the roots into good organic soil. That soil was buried by ash here. So we knew that we were going to have to dig through the ash and then put the roots in the soil underneath. That was going to be a real challenge since some of the ash was as deep as 2 feet. The plan was we'll stay as far away from the mountain as we can get. 18 miles is our farthest ownership from Mount St. Helens that was in this blast. So we started there the first year. The ash was only about 2 inches deep, so that made it simpler from that perspective, and we saved the worst for last because it was the closest to the mountain. The time we finished, which was 1987, we had a good feeling of the safety aspect of what was going to happen and felt more comfortable about moving closer and closer to the mountain. By the time we got done, we had reforested 45,500 acres with a little more than 18 million trees.
After the volcano stopped erupting and the land around here stabilized, a lot of people wanted to come up here to see what had happened. The problem is the road is out there somewhere, buried under a landslide. And so construction began on a new road. Construction began on the $165 million, 48-mile Spirit Lake Memorial Highway in 1986, after much planning and political maneuvering. The highway had to be built high above the valley floor to prevent it from being covered by another mudflow or landslide down the Toutle River Valley. It was also engineered to withstand earthquakes and future eruptions. In just 5 years, the highway was completed to Coldwater Ridge. One thing that makes this area special is that in 1982, President Ronald Reagan declared the blast zone a national volcanic monument. 110,000 acres were set aside for research, recreation, and education, with the focus on the environment being left to grow back naturally without human intervention. After the Spirit Lake Memorial Highway was completed, county, state, and federal agencies went into action to build 5 visitor centers, from Silver Lake to Hofstede Bluffs, the Forest Learning Center, Coldwater Ridge, and the Johnston Ridge Observatory. Visitors from around the world see firsthand the event history of the eruption and the mountain's recovery. One of the major problems caused by the eruption was all of that ash and sediment washing down the Toutle River and into the Columbia, where it disrupted shipping. So the Army Corps of Engineers designed and built the Sediment Retention Dam. It's a massive 1,800 feet long and 184 feet high and made from earth rather than concrete. Its sole purpose is to let the Toutle River flow but hold back the ash and sediment from the mountain. At the 20th anniversary of the eruption, Cowlitz County honored the 57 people who died in the 1980 blast.
We did a big memorial for those that were lost during the eruption of the mountain, and we have a big plaque at Hofstad Bluffs that's sort of dedicated to those who didn't make it. So we had a big ceremony there, and we've had several since to kind of celebrate and remember what we had here.
After the initial eruption, a lot of people were wondering, when is Mount St. Helens going to erupt again? After all, volcanoes are in a constant process of rebuilding themselves, and Mount St. Helens didn't disappoint.
March of 1982, there was an explosion from the dome, and it melted a bunch of snow and ice in the back wall of the crater, which broke out and created a flood down the North Fork Toutle River, a small mud flow that went essentially almost down to where Elk Rock is. We're looking at these loose, fragmented volcanic materials that are sort of draped on the landscape, just kind of piled up there. And where water runs down through it, like the canyons in front of the crater, it carves these tremendous notches in this loose material.
One of the big surprises following the eruption was not just the formation of the lava dome, but quite its opposite, a glacier right next to it.
After 1986, the mountain kind of went quiet, and went quiet for about 18 years. A glacier formed in the crater from the snowfall onto the rim and into the crater. That area around the back of the crater, shaded from the south by the crater walls and shaded by the lava dome to the north, was a perfect spot. So America's youngest glacier formed.
The mountain came back to life in 2004 to begin another major dome-building phase.
The first sign we had of it were swarms of earthquakes. Of course, again, earthquakes being an important indicator of rock fracturing and magma movement beneath the surface. So many of us expected this seismic swarm to kind of build and then die off. And each subsequent phone call that I'd get from the geologist is, Peter, it's continuing to increase. And so it became clear within the matter of days to a week that Mount St. Helens was getting ready to do something. Of course, the world's attention was focused on Mount St. Helens, and over the course of about 2 to 3 weeks, we went from a quiet volcano to one that was back into an eruption. We were getting a very large dump truck load of lava being erupted continuously into the crater every second. So at that rate, geologists calculated that it would be probably 100 years or less for that missing part of Mount St. Helens to be rebuilt. Mount St. Helens is not done, and we certainly need to watch it.
To some scientists, the quick regeneration of the area is not a big surprise. Eruptions and recovery are just a part of living in the Ring of Fire.
When Mount St. Helens gets busy, it can get very busy, and it can do impressive things. And that obviously builds a mountain that we know and love, but it also has some potential consequences in terms of the hazards associated with that volcanic activity.
Coldwater Lake didn't exist prior to the mountain's eruption, and now it's a symbol of the renewal of this area, because not only is it a great place to come and sit and spend an afternoon, it's also possible to catch fish in here.
Our planet has an incredible ability to regenerate and to see new growth.
As much as the eruption caused a change, so much is still the same. May never be quite the same, but in a lot of ways it will always be the same too.
There's no way stopping nature. It's going to do what it's going to do, and if it's erupted and come back 3 or 4 times, it's going to continue to do that. We can't screw it up enough that she can't fix it.
You see elk, deer, coyotes, cougar, mountain goats in the high country. Many of the same species that were there before the eruption are coming back. The area is alive with wildflowers in the summertime.
You'll often hear ecologists say, we expected this, it looked like a moonscape, it would take forever. Either I was too ignorant to have those expectations, or I just didn't feel like I had to pin anything on those expectations. I am often awestruck out there. I was when I first arrived, and I continue to be more awestruck than ever 20 years after working there. Many lupins can extract phosphorus from rocks that other plants can't access. It can avoid drought. These soils were very drought tolerant. It can pollinate itself, so it doesn't have to rely on a pollinator finding an isolated plant in that remote landscape.
Even an area like Spirit Lake, which saw total destruction both above and below the waterline, has come back to life.
Right now there are aquatic plants on the shore of Spirit Lake at the edge of the pumice plain, that is the side closest to the crater. So that certainly brings up the question of why is that happening? And the reason we think that's happening is because nutrients must be coming into the lake from the pumice plain. We think that that probably reveals that there's a striking link between the development of a new terrestrial plant community and what goes on in the lake at the edge of that community.
You just never dreamed that there'd ever be anything alive in that lake ever again. And geez, they're recording 4 and 5 pound rainbows in there now. So everything comes back.
The eruption 30 years ago affected so many lives, and for some of those folks, the change was profound.
The biggest impression it had on me is how temporary everything is. Not only life, but everything that you can see and everything that you're used to, how fast it can be gone. And you can only have a memory of what you never ever would have suspected would ever go away. Just do what you really want to do it when you can. If you can retire early, do it. Don't stay there to get the last dollar and then die 2 years later. Just do it right now while you got a chance, because we're so temporary.
The 1980 eruption is one of those things in my life that I compare to having children. There's nothing yet that compares to having children. This is a close second. Even today when I drive up here, it just never ceases to amaze me that these things were planted in an area that went through that kind of devastation and that deep ash. It makes me proud, and I'm sure that everybody at Weyerhaeuser's proud of what they've done here. I wonder sometimes, looking back on it, why me? Why was I placed here to go through all of this? I'm very proud of what's happened here.
My appreciation of the complexity at Mount St. Helens has grown by leaps and bounds. That even with relatively few species, things are extremely complex, and they're just quite different than perhaps than you see other places. My appreciation for how complex even relatively simple systems are has really grown.
Well, I kind of like to see it during my lifetime come back. Probably is going to take years and years, but it's coming back, and beauty is different, but there.
After 30 years since May 18th, 1980, people are coming up to the mountain to reconnect with the beauty and to remember what changed this landscape forever.
They're reminded of the devastation that was brought on by it, and they're amazed by the beauty that is coming out of that devastation. If you want to see a good example of the way that life takes care of itself, this is a great place for it.
people that haven't seen it really need to do that. And really opens your eyes to nature, the beauty of nature, and also the power of nature and what it can do to one's life. You don't realize that you have so much beauty and power right here, right locally. And people need to, local people I think ought to take advantage as well.
The earth is always changing, and as Mount St. Helens has shown us, this could be a place of great devastation and of great beauty. You really ought to get up here and see it sometime. Thank you for watching.